Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Whoever's listening, this is podcast number 318. And the subject today is advanced firearms training. And I have the great pleasure of having someone who's very, very good at this particular skill joining our team at the National Maritime Law Enforcement Academy as one of our premier instructors. And before we kind of get into the middle of it, I'll have him introduce himself. But to kind of lay it all out, what we'll talk about today is a little bit of Greg's background and then specifically what the foundational elements of this advanced firearms training is. And we'll talk a little bit more about its application in our world of work in the maritime domain. And then we'll close with a couple of thoughts. But just to begin, without me doing all the talking, Greg, great to have you on board. And if you could give everybody a little bit of background. And for those listening, this is Greg Cruz. And Cruz is the nickname. So you're going to have to explain that just to start off.
All right, Roger that. Well, first and foremost, Mark, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. I really look forward to becoming part of the team, and I'm excited about that. So for everybody who's listening, thank you for tuning in. My name is Gregory Cruz. My family name is Grutter. Cruz was a nickname I picked up in Afghanistan, and I really can't give you too much of an understanding of why they started to call me Cruz, but I can tell you that it spread like wildfire. The name stuck with me regardless of where I went in the country. I'd have some Afghan local, whether it be police, military, or a civilian, just out of the blue call me Cruz, and it just stuck. Well, the guy who kind of led this charge ended up losing his life to a fight that we were having with the Taliban, and the name stuck with me. I try to keep it alive to remember him and honor his sacrifice. So Cruz is kind of what I go by. It's what everybody calls me. At least my close friends do. Everybody else maybe hollers at me for whatever I've done wrong, but this is kind of what I go by.
Tell us a little bit about your background. You alluded to it a little bit, obviously time in the sandbox, but give us a little bit about your background and in particular your firearms experience and how you're going to use that in the delivery of these particular courses.
Absolutely. Be happy to. So right now I am the chief firearms instructor for the oldest active civilian law enforcement academy in the nation, run by one of the major firearms manufacturers in the world. I've been here just about 3 years now full-time, and I've worked here as an adjunct prior to that. After graduating high school about 1986, I went into the Marine Corps.
You're dating yourself now, Cruz. You're dating yourself by telling everybody 1986.
As young as I look, when I tell people I've done all this stuff, they don't believe me. So I got to throw those dates out there. I'm okay with that.
Good point.
So Marine Corps in '86, I did that for a number of years. I left active duty right after the Gulf War. I wanted to start a family, and I did that. So I was trying to find what was next path. I started in corrections. I worked corrections for a while, and then went to a local PD. While I was at the PD, I was an instructor at the PD. I was on the SWAT team and every other team I could be on. I taught at our municipal academy in Rhode Island for a number of years. I was the chief firearms instructor there for a number of years. Right after 9/11, I applied to the Federal Air Marshal program. I was selected as one of the first Air Marshals after 9/11. Proceeded into the training shortly thereafter. I set policy and precedent along with a number of other great instructors for the Air Marshal program as we know it today. Probably around 2004, I want to say, I had a bright idea that I would probably go back into the military and I might be able to retire with two pensions, one from the military and then one from the federal side of the house from the Air Marshals. I went back into the military and I really didn't realize how much I missed it. So I took a set of orders. It was supposed to last 6 months. And I returned back about 5 years later. Unfortunately, my military service, I got injured. So the military ended up retiring me. I got medically retired after about a total of 21 years in service. Went back to the Air Marshals. They looked at me and said, yeah, you're too busted up. We don't want you either. And they retired me. I was confused on what to do. I thought I was going to really enjoy retirement. Unfortunately, the list of honeydews I had really impeded my range time. So I started a small training company. I started a company called Interactive Gunfighting at a Dunkin' Donuts with a good friend of mine, drawing out some ideas on a napkin. And 5 or 6 years later, Interactive Gunfighting is going strong. This April actually is our 50-year anniversary, and doing well, so I still enjoy that. I've always been a firearms guy, from the basic infantryman all the way up to the advanced stuff that I've done with some great tier 1 units and people. I'm that guy who wants to seek the truth, and my life has been involved around this. I started off in the martial arts when I was young, moved into kickboxing. At the time, MMA was unheard of back in the day. But I did traditional martial arts. I did kickboxing. I wrestled a little bit, went to do Filipino knife and stick work, and that all morphed into helping my gun stuff as I continued down the road and learned all that. So this has kind of been my life. I don't do too much of anything else. So that's kind of where I'm at with a little bit of my background.
Well, it's quite a background. So you've touched on a lot of domains there: local law enforcement, of course, military experience, and then federal law enforcement. So I think that's important because our members come from all those disciplines, right? And it's important to be able to talk the talk and, in addition, walk the walk. But that's a great background and gives you obviously a good foundation to begin. So great intro, Cruz. Let's get into the actual training that you do. And one of the things that you've explained to me that I'd love for you to explain to everybody listening, and one of the things that I think make your training very unique, are what you call the 4 pillars. I have to be careful of my Boston accent here because the word pillars may not come out right, but I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. But talk for a few moments about those 4 pillars.
Absolutely. So the 4 key points, or the 4 pillars, would be that it's student-focused, fight-based, tactically sound, and court defensible. Okay,
that's pretty specific. And if you can go into a little bit more detail, let's take each one of them one at a time. Student-focused. What do you mean by that? I think I know as a master trainer, but tell me what you think student focused is.
So what I find in the firearms community is you have somebody who's very proficient and wants to step up in front of the class and run a drill and show everybody the time and how fast he was or how fast they're expected to perform. And that's not student focused. We have to be able to reach every student in that class, whether they be young and fit or seasoned and a little rusty. So by being student focused and focusing on outcome based numbers, we lose people. How many, how fast? We want to focus on performance. So each student should have the feeling that they left that class better than they came. Will they be better than the student left or right of them? That's an unknown. But each student should feel like they left better. So that touches each student individually, and that makes the class personal, which makes the training and the learning much more intuitive to that person, and they want to strive. If we run a physical fitness drill along with a shooting skill, we have them run laps or do push-ups or whatever, the younger, fitter people, or could be older and fit, will perform well, where somebody who may need to work on their physical performance is going to suffer, and their shooting may be well to begin with or good to begin with. By being a performance-based, we take away those outside stresses and we say, we're going to focus on this skill, break it down and show a progression that you're getting better in that skill. What's that progression? That progression is measured by your ability, not the ability of the instructor or the ability of the person left or right of you. That's where we really focus on that student focus.
Well, you're preaching to the choir here, because at the academy and through all the training that I've developed over the years, being learner-centric, another word for student-focused, is the same as what you're talking about. It's about creating that learning experience that's so much greater and so much more important than the content is. If we give an experience that they walk away from saying this was the most exciting and best training I ever had, we increase the likelihood of learning transfer. And that's why being student focused is so important. Let's move on to the next one, fight based. What do you mean by that?
So for a long time in the firearms community, we go to the range and we run drills and skill assessments and all this other stuff. And we tell the students that this is our best guess of what they're going to need to be proficient. This is our best estimate of what the fight for them is going to be like. And really, at the end of the day, to be honest, we're just guessing.
Yeah.
What I like to do is to add that force-on-force piece, put them in the gear and equipment, put them in a scenario-based situation, watch them perform, and then pull the things from that performance and say, hey, you did great. You showed up, you were aggressive, you moved well, but you know what? Your mechanical skills of getting the gun up to eye level, reloading, keeping the gun in the fight, they could use a little bit of polish. So let's take those mechanical skills that we've identified as an issue now and take those to the range. Instead of now guessing that, okay, well, let's add this and add that. We already know what we need to work on because you just showed me. My analogy to this, when I talk plain English, is the kickboxer who goes into the ring. Win or lose that kickboxing match, the next morning when he goes to the gym, he knows exactly what he needs to work on because he learned that lesson in the ring the night before or the day before. For the longest time, with law enforcement and military, we're not able to do that. But now with the use of simunitions and other non-lethal training aids, we can put them in the fight and draw those lessons right from the fight, as opposed to guessing what the training should be.
It's spot on. And another way to look at it, and again, why this is, people that know me have heard me say this time and time again, I like to train for what is most likely. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of training out there, especially in the aftermath of 9/11, especially in the maritime domain. There's a lot of cool training going on, right? It sounds good. The brochure looks really cool. The people doing the training sound like really cool instructors. But I always ask, what's the likelihood of that particular type of event happening in your everyday job? And if the likelihood is very remote, it doesn't mean that necessarily that I'm saying don't do the training, but let's go to the basics and let's make sure that we're preparing that officer for the things that he is likely to encounter tomorrow. In every course that we deliver, I ask this specific question at the conclusion of that day of training. Did you learn something today that you could apply to your job tomorrow? And that to me is the ultimate evaluation tool, if you will, of whether or not what we're teaching is making some impact on the learners, on the officers. So that fight-based foundation is very, very important. And I'd just add that element that it's based on what's likely to happen. Would you concur?
I would, and I would bring to the next degree of my third pillar of tactically sound. In the maritime community, it's Gucci to have a high-speed Navy SEAL come up in a fast boat alongside, throw up a caving ladder, climb on board, start clearing. Awesome class, awesome school, incredible people, but are you going to do that? Is that going to fit the job that you need to perform tomorrow? So when we talk about being tactically sound, the techniques that we teach have to fit the arena that you are going to fight in. That's the difference between what I like to teach and what a lot of other people teach. I don't want to teach all this Gucci complicated stuff. I want to teach the basics to a higher level so that regardless of what situation the officer finds himself in, he'll have the tools to be able to draw on to be able to solve that problem. I always want to build thinking fighters. I don't want to give them a roadmap that may not take them where they need to go if the road gets clogged with options. They need to be able to see what's available, answer that, solve that, move forward. See what's available, answer it, solve it, move forward. And by able to do that, it has to be tactically sound. The techniques that we teach have to be at a higher level of basics that are just foundational, solid. So I try to stay away from all that high-speed Gucci stuff. And, is it fun? Is it cool? Absolutely. But in today's training venues, where money is an issue, overtime is an issue, officer safety is an issue. It's great to go to this high-speed training, but if I break an officer who cannot go back to work now, I've caused a ripple effect in that agency by having to create overtime and medical issues. So that training really has to be thought out well. Does it fit? Does it work? Does it work for me? Does it fit for me on my agency?
Well, that's great. And the last pillar you mentioned was legally defensible. Explain that a little.
Legally defensible. Yeah, absolutely. Legally defensible or court defensible is, at the end of the day, you need to be able to stand up in front of a judge and say that the actions that you were trained in, another reasonable or responsible individual in your skill set, in your background, would do the same thing. There are some phenomenal people out there teaching some phenomenal stuff, but at the end of the day, we're not Navy SEALs, we're not British SAS, we're not Special Forces, we're maritime law enforcement officers with a very complicated and detailed job, and we have to be able to say that what we're doing holds up to the letter of the law. So we spend a lot of time on not shooting. We spend a lot of time on understanding use of force. We spend a lot of time on understanding policy and procedures, how they differ from land-based interdiction when we have to worry about maritime and maritime rules. We have to be able to change from one gear to the next when that waterborne operation now becomes a land-based operation. And there's a lot of different things to be considered. So all those pieces have to work together. I've often been to places and got really cool little nuggets of information and come back and said, yeah, that was awesome. I loved it, but I can't use hardly any of that because my department isn't that big. Our jurisdiction is different, whatever the case may be. So we have to look at it from that end, because that's a liability issue that the administration of whatever agency we're working at is going to have concern with. What if something this person is teaching my people goes wrong? Is this going to be something that I'm going to be able to defend? Is this something that I'm going to be held liable for? That liability thing is a huge, huge risk nowadays with law enforcement officers when it comes to training.
Oh, you've hit that nail on the head. That's where I was going to go, because in this era that we live in, what we're finding and the research that we've done at the academy level is, and there's another white paper that we're working on right as we have this conversation, in that many of the decisions made by officers at the contact level, at the engagement level, made by the supervisors as they give guidance to their officers, and from leaders' perspective when they're making decisions about what sort of training they should do or what their policy should say or not say, there's an element throughout that whole level, all those tiers, and this is Mark's words, they're fear-based, meaning from the officer level and the engagement, he's making decisions because he's fearful. And I'm not saying he's a bad person. I'm not saying he's a coward.
I totally understand.
And
absolutely.
At the supervisor level, because they're the ones bearing the brunt of all these attacks from the public and media and all that, they're making decisions that are fear-based. And then lastly, the leaders, the chiefs, the colonels, the heads of these departments are making policy decisions based on fear, which, if approached that way, and I'll let you chime in here in a second, if those decisions are made based on that, what it leads to is actually more conflict. So the more fearful you are based on your decision tree, whether you're that officer making that engagement, whether you're the supervisor telling them what to do and give them guidance, or whether you're the leader of that organization making policy decisions, because you drive it by fear, you actually create more instances for conflict, more instances for violence, and more instances to be sitting in a court and having to explain what you did. So I know you wanted to say something. I'll let you talk here for a second based on that.
Absolutely, and I appreciate that. Great points. And if we just look at current events and try to separate our feelings from the actual tactics and stuff that we need to learn from these lessons. In this recent shooting, we now have officers that disobeyed orders and went into the building to try to find the shooter, who now find themselves suspended. We had officers on the outside knowing full well that they should have gone inside. And give me just a little bit of latitude when I say this. I'm a law enforcement officer and I understand what criminal acts are. And as a law enforcement officer, when I involve a criminal act, I will apply my force continuum as it's needed to that criminal act. When an evil entity enters a school and begins to kill people without any type of remorse, to me, that's not criminal anymore, that's evil. And I'm going in there and I'm going to stop that evil with a level of violence and aggression that is beyond criminal acts. Because I want the next person to think twice when they see what has happened. We have taken that ability of the officers to respond to something like that. I used to tell my military members, you know what, some days your job sucks. And when there's somebody in a school or an active shooter event, your job sucks that day. But your risk is to go in there and save those people that you took an oath to take care of. And if that means putting yourself in harm's way, then that's what it is. But we want to train those people to give them the tools and the skill set to mitigate that risk to themselves, because their duty is still to respond to those people who are losing their lives. And I agree with you 100%. We have put so much emphasis on liability and degraded the training that we give our officers to the point where, and I don't mean to belittle any officers, there's phenomenal people with a terrible job, but the training we give them on an average is subpar at best, and we need to be better at that. We need to empower them with the understanding that when they do something, they're doing it with good training, good tactics, and good leaders. They're going to back them because they're following policy and they're doing what's right. And at the end of the day, a policy should just be the difference between right and wrong with some verbs put in there to make it, a paragraph or two. As an officer, I need to know if I respond to a shooting and there's somebody killing people, my job is to go in there and stop that killing.
Yeah.
We've gone full circle on this. As a young officer, I remember it was stop, wait, perimeter, negotiation, SWAT, and people are getting killed. Now, when I teach my active shooter program, if it's you may be the only officer and your job is to go in there and neutralize that threat. And that's, that day your job sucked. And, you need to take a bite of that.
Well, yeah, you're again preaching to the choir on this end, and that's in the active shooter programs that we consult with and we deliver from an academy perspective, specifically targeting the maritime domain. We talk about that history. Columbine taught us a lot, and we changed a lot of policies. However, there's a lot of evolution that's happened even in that time frame, and tactics and techniques have evolved. The mantra now is, especially in light of events like the Pulse event, like San Bernardino, like Las Vegas, it's A, stop the killing, B, stop the dying. And so you got to mitigate that threat as quickly and efficiently as possible. And how we move through buildings, how we move through vessels now, how we move through ferry systems or cruise ships, that's been adapted. It's about, how do I get to target as quickly as possible? How do I mitigate that threat? And now, how do I deal with the aftermath? So keeping going here, because we're on a roll. You had mentioned, I just want to go back to this particular point, the critical things that make this different. If you could explain that. We talked about the 4 pillars, but what are those critical things that make this training different from other training that's out there?
If I had to dial it down to one thing, is the student-focused portion being fight-based, where the instructor is going to be with the student watching those force-on-force scenarios, and those scenarios can range from mild to wild. What I like to do, especially with the force-on-force, is not to make it a long, dragged-out thing. I'm going to look for certain responses from the officer, and I'm going to put them in a short, quick scenario that would enlist that response if they're paying attention and picking up on what they should be watching and looking at. But it gives me a first-hand view of where I need to go with the training. Then I will look at the group and say, am I seeing this as a whole amongst the group? Is this a deficiency that I now can identify throughout the group? Or is it just isolated to 1 or 2 shooters that may have missed a block of instruction? where now I can go back and say, hey, boss, this is what I see overall, that we need work in these areas. On top of that, I noticed that a few offices could use some work here. So what am I saying? Let's do a program that covers this area, and let's do a little remedial training in these areas. Let's touch on them, but let's put our main effort in these areas. And I think a lot of programs don't do that because it's intensive for the instructor. It's not just show up and plug and play something. You have to be involved. You have to put in some time and get a little ownership with them in their skills and assessment. It's a little bit more labor intensive.
So the biggest thing that I hear is when you said the critical things that make this different than everything else is that student focus. And in particular, I'm going to paraphrase, you tell me if I'm wording it right. You adapt and tailor to the skills and abilities of the officers in that class on that
Correct.
day. Okay. Because I think that's a big thing, and that again is another key element of the training that the Academy does. If you go on our website, we kind of emphasize the point that we tailor the training based on the unique needs of everybody that's asking us to come and train them. Yes, there are best practices that we utilize and that we apply, but most importantly, it's what are the unique needs of that particular audience at that time, because there is unfortunately no cookie cutter that you can apply to all people and all things that's going to get everybody on that same playing field. You got to, although there are good structured courses, sometimes you have to tailor to the unique application. And the best example I think that I can give is the maritime domain. There are a lot of firearms courses across the country. They're standards. They are, in my opinion, kind of cookie cutter approach, and they deal with everything that's kind of going to go on in a landside terrestrial type environment. And we know that the maritime environment is nothing like that. First and foremost, it moves a lot. It moves under your feet. Second, there aren't a lot of backups that are on their way, especially if you're looking at this from an active shooter perspective. There's not a lot of cars that are going to roll up and be a block away and set up a staging point to answer this particular threat. So those types of things, I think, require the training to be tailored to the unique needs of that department, those officers on that day.
I agree. The other point that I'd like to bring up with fight-based
Sure.
is that a number of classes that I've attended in workshops and whatnot always gave me, for lack of a better term, a piece of the puzzle. And what I try to do is to make sure that when we're working on fight-based training, that each piece we give them works with the piece that was before it and the piece that's after it, so that there's a real congruency in all the training that they receive, so that it blends and the transition from technique to technique is very smooth. I remember as a young recruit in the academy, in defensive tactics, I was told to stand one way. In firearms, I was told to stand another way. In officer survival, I was told to stand another way. And when it came time to be evaluated, I'm like, okay, well, what do you want to see? Because I don't know how you want me to stand. So when we talk fight-based, there should be a normal progression from officer presence is my lowest form of use of force, all the way up until my deadly force applications of whatever weapon system or tools that I have at my disposal. So there's another piece there that I think is important too. And in the maritime community, that's a big thing, because tailoring the tactics to the lack of backup, to the lack of all the other tools that some of the land-based agencies may have is critical in understanding why we're doing some of the things that we're doing. And I think that's a huge piece that needs to be brought forward.
I agree. One of the things that you had mentioned to me before is the missing link, and you talked about administration, the missing link from administration, and I think to the officer level. Can you explain that a little bit, what you meant by that?
Absolutely. A lot of times the administration is driven by a different animal. We've got budgetary restraints. We've got all kind of outside pressure on us to make sure that we're politically correct and we are, picture perfect in the outside eye. And then there's a break from that to what is actually happening on the ground. That, at least I believe my experience has been, my best leaders are the ones that have come up through the ranks, who know what the job is every day and have not forgot where they came from. A number of times we have that disconnect now where we have administrators that come in from outside areas because they're good at logistics and administration, but might not have been a grassroots type person coming up through the ranks. So to be able to bridge that gap and to be able to give them good, solid information so they understand and feel a part of what is going on as opposed to an opposing force. When somebody says to me, no, thanks, Chris, by the way, the obstacle is the way. I'm just looking for a different way to get there. So when an administrator says to me, hey, I don't have enough money to do that, I'm not sure if they're understanding why I'm asking for that. So I want to go back and say, okay, well, it's not an assault on me and my training ability. They may not understand why. So now if I'm able to show them, hey, these are your offices, this is what we're having an issue with, and this is why I'm asking for this range time or this overtime or this money to be able to do this training. It also gives them a way to validate the budget that we're asking for. While I was working with my last federal agency, that was a big thing. We had a really big budget, but you had to validate the use of it. And just to say, okay, we're going to go to the range and run a bunch of drills, that was very yesterday's thinking. Why are we doing these drills? How do they benefit us? What's the overall outcome? How is it going to make the shooters better than they came? So there was a lot of thought process that had to go in. Why are we doing the things that we're doing? And again, without some type of way to measure this, it was all guesswork. So by putting them into the fight, or into the ring, as I like to say, it was a clear measurement of what we were missing, what we were good at, what we needed to add. And it gave me the ability to validate why I'm asking for these things. It also educated the administration staff on why it is we need this amount of ammo, why it is we need this amount of training, and it gave them more of a buy-in to understand what we were doing. And to me, it helped bridge that gap quite a bit, which made things very, very comfortable inside that community.
That's a good point. One thing that we didn't kind of cover, and I want to cover right now, is your background. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you're uniquely qualified to give this training.
Ooh, unique. I'm not even sure. I'll give you my background, but thank you for that. If you haven't picked up from the accent already, I'm from Alabama. So I graduated high school, 86, went in the Marine Corps, spent a number of years in the Marine Corps, left the Marine Corps to become a family man, got married, had children, went into law enforcement, worked in corrections for a while, worked some local police, and after 9/11, I became a federal air marshal. When I got involved with the air marshal program, I went to the training side of the house right away, and I was on the ground floor of the new training program that the new air marshals are still using today. So the whole firearms program from A to Z, I was involved in throughout the whole air marshal program. I worked at both our first initial academy and our second follow-on academy. I also taught extensively at my field office. In that time period, I decided that being that I was in a federal position, maybe I go back to the military, do some more years in the military, and be able to retire with 2 pensions. Went back into the military, which didn't make my wife very happy at all. Spent a number of years completing a total of 21, but getting injured. So I was medically retired from the military, and then medically retired from the Air Marshal Service as well. I left that thinking that retirement was going to be wonderful, and it was terrible. So I started a small training company on my own that's done very well. Shortly after that, I was approached by one of the leading firearms manufacturers in the world to be the chief firearms instructor for their academy. And it's kind of Cruz in a nutshell.
So we kind of covered a lot of things. Is there any, as we wrap this thing up in the next couple of minutes here, is there any final points that you'd want to make to the people that would be listening to this about the training and why you think it is very important that from a maritime perspective, if they're involved in law enforcement, if they're gun carriers, if they're going to find themselves in an engagement, they should be wanting to put you on the top of their list as far as someone they want to request training from?
So, this is one of those things where I tend to be a little bit on the humble side, and I've got to kind of get out of that shell a little bit. What I would say to somebody who's asking me that and try to provide them an answer is, don't believe a word I say, but look at the passion I bring with me. Does that support my actions? I can't tell you what my paycheck is, how many vacation days I have, what I get for overtime, but I can tell you with passion about the things that I feel strongly about, and that's taking care of officers that are going into harm's way. My wife will work out the vacation and the pay and all that other stuff, but I have a passion for what I do, and that passion bleeds over. And I've had that. That, I think, carries the day for me. The training stands on its own. If I wasn't sure of what I said, I couldn't come out. I don't have any of this written down. It's not scripted. It comes right from my heart. I've been an infantry guy my whole life. I'm just a trigger puller. But I've tried to take that and elevate it to a very high level because I think that I should be the best trigger puller I can be. In each situation, whether it's been in the Marine Corps, special operations, law enforcement, corrections, wherever it was, I've always tried to elevate that. I bring a lot of passion and a lot of enthusiasm. People will ask me, well, how long is a training day? When we're done. I don't care how long the day, when we're done. Well, how do I know when we're done? When you've reached that area of proficiency that I think that you need to be at. So there's a lot of non-standard stuff that comes with this, for lack of a better term, and I'm not sure how to wordsmith that to make it pretty. At the end of the day, the thing I care about is the lives of the officers and the people that we're sworn to save and protect. That's the bottom line. I don't care about money, fame, Gucci gear, pictures, lights, video, all that crap. I'm here to help people stay alive. I want to take the lessons that I've learned in combat, that I've paid for, that my friends have paid for through blood, sweat, and tears, and give those to people and hopefully make their lessons a little bit less painful, a little bit less costly.
Well, that's a great way to end. Thank you for taking the time to share with us all that information about firearms training. For those people listening to this particular podcast, they can ask for more information by sending an email to info@nmlea.org, or they can actually send it to Cruz himself. Send an email to cruz@nmlea.org, and he'll be sure to get right back to you. Thanks, and have a great day.